So we're going to have a great presentation, and at the end, we're going to have some time for Q&A. And then we'll have some trivia and give away some pretty cool prizes, all right? But first, our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Megan Bryan. Dr. Megan Bryan holds a PhD in literature, specializing in 19th century vampire literature from the University of York. She teaches at the University of North Texas, the English department there, and she is a published author of vampire literature. Yeah, so please welcome our speaker, Dr. Megan Bryan.
Thank you, everybody. How are we all doing today? We having a good Halloween so far? That's not very enthusiastic. Good Halloween so far? Ready to learn about vampires? Awesome. All right. I know this is being filmed, so you all don't have a microphone yet, but I'll repeat what you say. Does anyone want to tell me some things they think they know about vampires? Just shout out loudly so I can hear. Bloodsucker, very good. Yep. Anything else? Immortal, yes. Romania, very good. Yep. What is, sorry? Yeah. Bram Stoker, good. Yeah. So yeah, you know a lot of things, and you know a lot of things that aren't wrong. That's good. I like not having to correct misinformation right first thing. So yeah, it would be really impossible to trace the actual history of a blood-sucking monster, because literally every culture in the world, every religion in the world has this kind of demonic entity, somebody who drinks blood, who needs blood to survive, who can come back from the dead. So what we think of as a vampire today is actually a very specific type of blood-drinking creature that originated in Romania, actually in Eastern Europe more broadly. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about that history and how that transferred into what we know today. So we'll get started. So again, I don't know how much you know about European history, but for hundreds and hundreds of years, you had the Ottoman Empire, which was the Turks, over in the eastern part of the world, and then you had the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, which ran most of Western Europe. And these two empires are constantly fighting for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's conflict, people are taking land from each other, people are giving land back, there's treaties, it's a whole mess for hundreds of years. And in the year 1718, the Ottoman Empire gives back this part of Eastern Europe to the Austrian Empire. And this is Wallachia, Serbia, and Banat, which is now part of modern-day Romania, so you're quite right. And this is called the Peace of Passarowitz in 1718. So Austria gets this land back, and they think, let's go send people to survey our land, see what we got. And Austria sends dignitaries, it sends doctors, it sends soldiers to go look at what's going on here. And they discover that there's this weird custom a lot of people in these villages have of digging up bodies and desecrating them, you know, putting stakes through their hearts, taking out pieces of their bodies, burning their hearts. And they think, what is going on here? Because lots of people are reporting this phenomenon. And so they send, in 1731, they send representatives, they send people who are very educated, knowledgeable, doctors, high-ranking military officials, government bureaucrats, to go and say, what are these people doing? What is going on here? And again, this is this region of Eastern Europe. And these people report back. They write these reports, and they're collected in this book, as I say, in 1731. And it lists all these accounts. Again, this one's signed by the imperial provisor of the Gradis districts. That's a very high-ranking official. These are not peasants who are reporting on this stuff. These are learned representatives, the intellectuals of their day. And they are saying, what we have seen is these bodies are coming back to life and drinking the blood of their neighbors. And that's what they're actually reporting to the Austrian government. Respectable people. And so this is one that's collected in this collection of reports, as I say, in 1731, called Peter Plagojewicz. And we can't go through the whole thing one at a time, probably, but we'll just do some highlights here. So Peter Plagojewicz is killed very suddenly. He dies after a very short illness, very quick duration, and that's very common for the vampire. It usually appears after there's a plague and people are dying very quickly. And obviously the scientific explanation for this is that when people die very quickly, we're not always sure that they're dead. You just kind of throw them in the graves. And they're very shallow graves because when a plague is spreading, you don't have a lot of time to dig these deep 6-foot things. And so a lot of people just got up and said, well, I'm not dead. And they thought, oh no, they've risen from the dead, right? So that's one explanation. But again, it's very common for the vampire to appear after an illness. The traditional folklore vampires were not noblemen. I know that's what we think of today as like Count Dracula, but these people were just peasants. They were your friends, they were your neighbors. And they would die, and then they would suddenly come back from the dead. And you'd be really glad to see them because they're your family and your friends. But they're here to kill you, so, it's not so nice. And what would happen with the traditional vampire is, I know we think of today, like they bend down, they puncture the neck with their teeth. That's not what would happen. The traditional vampire was more like the old hag in a sort of nightmarish thing. It was someone who would come onto the bed and strangle you while you slept. And that's how it would kill you. It wouldn't drain your blood. It would drink your blood afterwards, but it would strangle you. And so a lot of people who are attacked by vampires report feeling like pressure on their chest while they're being drained, because there's this thing sitting on top of them and they can't breathe, which is, again, very different to the conception of vampires we have today. And you would know the person was a vampire, well, first because people would say, I've been attacked by this guy who was dead. And the second thing is that there'd be certain marks. And so it was always, if the body was undecomposed, if the body didn't decompose quickly enough, and they always said fresh skin was grown. Now again, the scientific explanation for this is that when you die, your skin kind of comes off, and so it looks like you have a fresh layer of skin, but it's actually just the underside of your skin. I think the exterior is the epidermis. I don't remember what the interior is called, but that's what happens. It's a natural decomposition process, but to them they thought, oh, they're growing new skin because they're becoming a new entity, essentially. And what would always happen when you tried to get rid of vampires, you need to stake them, and then they'd say, they're a vampire because the blood would pour out of them. Like, you'd stake them and it would just come out. And they said, well, that's because they've been feeding on blood. That's actually not true. It's because when you die, your blood goes to sort of your lungs. It sort of coagulates. And so if you puncture near the lungs, the blood is all collected there and it's going to spurt out. So again, now we know there's a very natural scientific explanation for a lot of these phenomenon. But of course, they didn't know that back then. They were just trying to make the best of what they had. And this is another one called the Shoemaker of Breslau. Breslau's in Poland, but against these Eastern European regions. And this is very important because, as I said, there's these wars that are taking place the whole time. With war comes plagues, comes famine. So the region of Europe where this is happening is really this region of a mix of religions, because you have the Islamic Empire and the Christian Empire, a mixture of cultures, and all this stuff that's going on, great change, war, famine, disease, and this is where the vampire is sort of born, is from this odd mixture of all these things. And this guy is another peasant, but he's actually a well-off guy. He's a shoemaker, he has a trade, but he's still not an aristocratic vampire, which again is what we think of today. And he kills himself. And death by suicide is a surefire way if you're going to become a vampire. Because again, the Catholic Church considers that the mortal sin, it cannot be forgiven, and so you will be cursed. And how will you be cursed? You'll become a demon, essentially, a blood-drinking demon. But you hear, this has the same sort of things we were talking about, the strangling victim, the suffocation feeling, and then the fresh skin grow. This one, they said they also know it's a vampire because they had an odd mole on their toe, which is like the devil's mark. And if you know anything about the history of witchcraft, the devil's mark can literally be anything. It can be an odd mole pattern. It can be you have an extra finger. It can be you have a freckled pattern on your face that looks a bit like a star or something. It's just a way to explain the inexplicable, essentially. And then the corpse is bloated, which again I've talked about, is the blood coagulating, but they thought it was you drank a lot of blood and your body would puff up like a leech. That's in Dracula, he's described as a filthy leech because he's gorged with blood. And what they did, you want to stake him, but then of course you also want to remove the head and burn the heart and the body. It's really just getting rid of all the physical signs of vampirism. And we'll go, I think, not this one. Yeah, we'll go here. So I've talked a bit about this. Suspected after mass death in the village, so it's associated with plagues. The vampire usually attacks its own family first and then spreads to the rest of the village. And so it destroys its closest members first and then its community, essentially. It doesn't just pick random victims. That's part of its curse. It comes at night to smother or throttle the sleeper in bed, and you can tell it's a vampire because there's no signs of decay. There's supple limbs and fresh skin with the devil's mark, blood on the mouth, and often suicides are those who had died violently or engaged in immoral behavior. And this is written in Hungarian text, that people who can become vampires are the kinds of people you'd suspect witches, demons, sorcerers. They also said treacherous barmaids. And I'm like, I don't know the backstory with that, but I really want to know the backstory with that. Like, what experience did this guy have with a barmaid? But this is Dom Calmet, and he collects all of these stories in 1714. He's a Benedictine monk. And he says, "Thanks be to God, we are no means credulous. We avow that all the light which science can throw on this fact discovers none of the causes of it. Nevertheless, we cannot refuse to believe that to be true, which is juridicially attested and by persons of probity. So he's basically saying, it's hard to believe in vampirism. It doesn't seem like a thing that should exist, but we've all had all these experts come and give their expert opinion and said these things happen, so we're going to trust the experts and follow the science. That is what he's actually doing. And so he collects these tales and he publishes them in 1746. And I'll go over this sort of again because it's very important. The traditional ways of killing the vampire, we've talked about staking, head cut off, dismember the body, heart removed and burn, stake through the heart. And these are some graves that we've actually recently discovered. I say recently, this one's 2014, but this one's actually September of 22, so this is very recent. And you can see they've buried this woman, and they've put this sickle over her neck. And that's because they think if she gets up, her head's going to get cut off. So that'll stop the vampire. And it's similar here. This one's got a iron stake through its heart. Iron's very good against any kind of demonic entity because it's the crucifixion. Jesus was crucified with iron nails, and so that's why you put like iron horseshoes over your doors. Any kind of demonic entity is repelled by iron, so the story goes. So an iron stake is very good as well as a wooden one. And then they've also taken this person's leg off because they're like, well, if he gets up, he won't be able to go far because he'll have to hop around. And again, it sounds kind of silly to us, but if you're the kind of person who doesn't understand how science works, doesn't understand the scientific method, you're just doing the best you can with what you observe, right? And you observe that if the body's going to come back, a good way to stop the body from killing us is to make it so it can't move, right? Cut off its head, remove its limbs, make sure if it gets around, it can only hop, it can't attack us. So it's actually a very sensible way of dealing with this supernatural creature, I think. And that's also why the garlic is an effective deterrent, is because if there's actually scientific studies to this day, if you eat a lot of garlic in your food, mosquitoes don't like to attack you because garlic repels bloodsuckers. It makes your blood taste funny. And so, again, that's a scientific thing we know now. They didn't know that back then, but they just observed, oh, you know, insect bloodsuckers don't like garlic, so probably human bloodsuckers won't like it either. So it's great. Before the scientific method, it's a way of using the scientific method to try and fight this creature. As I say, the first collection was published in 1743, and it's published in French. And at the time, who can read French? Well, people in France, and also the educated classes among the British aristocracy. They were taught to speak French because English was the common language, and if you wanted to talk badly about your servants behind their back, you'd speak in French, because only educated people knew French. And so that's how the vampires transferred from Eastern Europe into Britain. It goes via the aristocracy. So this is Lord Byron. I don't know if any of you know anything about Lord Byron. He was sort of a rake of his day, sort of a hellraiser kind of guy. And he and his friends read Dom Calmet's reports of these vampires. And they said, well, that'd be a cool thing to include maybe in some poetry, because they're mostly poets, or some stories. And so Byron writes a poem called The Giaour. This is here. And he talks about the vampire. And it's, you know, you have to drain the blood of your family first, essentially. And he has a friend, not really a friend, friend/rival called Robert Southey, who writes a poem about vampires and then includes a whole footnote where he just transcribes those accounts from the book in English. And he says, this is what I'm talking about for those of you who don't know. So even if you don't read French, if you're a regular person in England, you can buy the works of Lord Byron, who is incredibly popular. And so you start to get interested in this thing that he's talking about, this vampire thing. And Lord Byron is exiled from Britain in 1816 because of rumors of sexual impropriety with his half-sister. And so he flees to the continent because apparently that kind of behavior is okay on the continent, or so he thinks. And he goes with a physician because he's not well physically, he's not well mentally. And he goes with a physician called Dr. John Polidori, who's not very well known, still isn't very well known. And he and Polidori meet up with Mary Shelley, who's not Mary Shelley at the time. She's 16 years old. She hasn't married Percy yet, but she is on holiday with Percy in the Villa Diodati in Switzerland. And they all decide to hang out together because they all kind of know each other, and they're all very aristocratic, interesting, artistic people. And they stay in this villa together. And one night, it's storming and raining, and you can't go outside. And Lord Byron says, well, why don't we all try writing a ghost story? Because that'd be kind of cool. We've never tried that before. And Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, who are poets, think that writing prose is a bit common. They're not really going to do that, so they kind of give up. But Mary Shelley, that night, starts writing Frankenstein, which, of course, is her most famous work. It's going to be published in 1818. And Polidori, Byron's physician, starts writing a work about a vampire called The Vampire. Not very creative, but there we are. And it's published in 1819. And the vampire in that particular tale is modeled on Lord Byron. He's very much meant to be Lord Byron. It's clearly an avatar for him. He's a nobleman who's very cold and callous and uses women and doesn't care about women. But this novel is an instant hit because Byron's publisher gets a hold of Polidori's manuscript and says, well, nobody knows who Polidori is, but if I lie and say it's written by Lord Byron about Lord Byron, the public's going to go crazy for that. And so he does. He publishes it as a story by Lord Byron, and the public does go crazy for it, and they buy it in spades. And Byron is so mad because he's like, I didn't write this trash. I wouldn't write this trash about me. How dare you? And Polidori does not get credit for it. Polidori is very embarrassed about it and says, I didn't really mean for it to be published. It was just a thing I was writing for a contest. Please don't publish it anymore. But the publisher says, money! And so he just keeps printing it under Lord Byron's name. And so it becomes very associated with Lord Byron, this kind of romantic, evil nobleman who goes around seducing women, drinking blood. At the time, there was a rumor that Lord Byron had murdered one of his mistresses and drank blood from a skull cup from her skull, essentially. So that's the kind of stories that were going on around Byron. And poor Polidori, as Mary Shelley says here, she says, poor Polidori, he dies a couple years later in obscurity. He commits suicide and never became very successful. Today, nobody knows who he is. People always think, oh, the vampire, Lord Byron. It's not Lord Byron, it's Polidori. And so I sort of feel bad for him, and I like to give more recognition to him because he really popularized the vampire in English. We wouldn't have the associations, again, with the aristocratic, with any of the things that we know about vampirism without Polidori. And so, you know, I'm very saddened about him. But this is how Polidori is described. This is actually a picture of him. And then what he actually does, and this is a very good summation of it, is that he transforms the vampire into a glamorous aristocrat. He makes him this kind of libertine figure. And in his story, it's a morality tale. It's like you shouldn't mess with bad people, essentially. But you can tell there's a lot of influence about Byron in that character. And Polidori writes it as a kind of warning, but people don't always take it as a warning, right? And from 1819, when it's published, until the mid-century, you have people writing like fanfic about this particular vampire. It's called Lord Ruthven, based on Lord Byron. And people write like plays about him. They write unauthorized sequels to this. Alexandre Dumas, who wrote Three Musketeers, did this whole play called Ruthven and the Vampires in 1840, which was a huge hit in France. Again, there wasn't copyright law back in those days, so you could just write whatever the heck you wanted. But Lord Ruthven became like the definitive vampire, like the Count Dracula of our time. But again, poor Polidori didn't get any credit for it, so that's sad. And if you go into the mid-century, so 1840, again, the vampire is around at this point in time. And I have to give you some backstory on this. He's published, there's a new character called Lord Varney who's published in A Penny Dreadful. And A Penny Dreadful is really like, if you read comic books today, they do like, they're very cheap. You know, you buy single issues, and then there's like a cliffhanger, and you buy more issues. And these things are all collected like a comic book cycle day and like a graphic novel. But in comic books today, the plot sort of has to make sense because the readers get kind of mad. Back in the 1840s, the plots didn't have to make sense. There was like no character consistency. It was just random people would write random variations of the character. So think about it's like Batman written in the 66, Batman with the Adam West and the POW, and then next week followed by a sort of Robert Pattinson Batman. Like it was just tonally very difficult. So it's not a great work, but this is Lord Varney, who's the vampire from this. And he is notable because he's the first sort of romantic vampire. Again, Polidori's Lord Ruthven was very much, he would use women, he would laugh while he drains them. But Varney has this weird curse where he's saying, if you love me as I am, my curse will be broken, I'll no longer be a vampire. Which sounds a bit Twilighty, right? But it was going along in the 1840s. And Flora is the girl he proposes to, and she says, God, no, I'm never gonna marry you. And so then he gets mad and becomes even worse. But you have this hint of like the more romantic vampire, which is coming along in the mid-19th century. You have Carmilla in 1872, and this is, again, a very romantic vampire. She's the first female vampire who's featured as a main character. And she is in love with a woman, which is obviously very notable in 1872, because homosexuality was considered, you know, aberrant at that particular point in time. But she's very sympathetically written by, the author's name is Sheridan Le Fanu. He's an Irish writer. And he makes her very sympathetic and very sweet, and you almost kind of want her to win, but of course she doesn't win. She gets staked and has to burn in hell forever because of her sexuality, apparently. but it's a very sympathetic portrayal of a vampire as a sort of nuanced creature, right, which you'd see more now. But then you get Dracula, and Dracula is published in 1897, and it is a return of the vampire, despite what you think from various movie versions, to the more Byronic, I just use women and destroy them, I don't feel anything. Because Dracula in the book is an unfeeling monster. He doesn't have emotions, he doesn't love people, he's very monstrous. And this is because Bram Stoker, well, likely, we don't obviously know, but Bram Stoker based him on the real Dracula, which is Prince Vlad III of Wallachia, known as the Impaler. And if you know anything about Vlad the Impaler, he was kind of a bad dude, even at his particular time in which he lived, where you had these horrible rulers torturing people, putting them in boiling oil. But Vlad the Impaler was like another level, right? There are rumors that he once impaled 20,000 people in a city. And that was how he drove off the Turkish invasion, essentially, because he was in Wallachia, in this borderland between the Christian and the Islamic empires, and so his people are getting killed, and he's like, I'm going to defend my homeland from these people. And he does that by fear, and by horrible violence, and by becoming the worst monster ever, so nobody'd want to mess with him, essentially. And it works. The Turkish Sultan sees this forest of death and flees. He says, I'm not going further into this land where this madman lives, essentially. So he uses fear tactics, and it really works. But he's not well-liked, obviously, because he's kind of a monster. And so there's all this stuff that's put out about him. We don't know how much of it is actually true. I suspect a lot if you study his life. But, you know, this thing where he sits under the corpses of his victims and eats, probably not true. Probably didn't do that. And this is what he supposedly looked like. This is from a contemporaneous portrait. So this is as close as we've got to Dracula. I probably don't have time to go through all the different stories about him. You can Google him. He's very exciting. But he is sort of a national hero in Romania to this day. He's sort of this King Arthur figure because he defended his homeland from the invasion. There's this prophecy that, like, in Transylvania's need, he's going to come back, right, and save us all. And so he's a national hero there. They honor him. There's all these statues to him. And they don't really like the association of him with this murderous vampire. But they're very nice if you ever go there. Like, I do recommend you go to Romania, by the way. Lovely people. And they like to talk about it and tell you why he's not this horrible vampire character. Anyway, Stoker publishes Dracula in 1897, so the end of the Victorian era. And he bases the character on Vlad the Impaler. He says that he is a member of a conquering race who defended his homeland and drove the invading forces back. Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means there's like different, there's letters from different people, different narrators, and so that adds to the kind of uneasiness of the work because you don't really know who's telling the truth all the time. Dracula actually doesn't speak in it at all. He is written via Jonathan Harker, who's one of the narrators, but he doesn't have his own voice, and so again, it's interesting to read in that context because you're like, well, how much of this is true and how much isn't? Any academic discussion of Dracula often talks about it as a reverse colonization narrative. Basically, the British Empire is colonizing the world, so what happens when the world comes back and destroys it from within, essentially? I think it's a really simplistic reading. I don't think that fully encapsulates what's so great about the novel. I do encourage you to read the novel if you have time, but it's really good and it's very complicated. And shortly after the novel's publication, again, 1897, you get the first film version, which is 1922. It's made in Germany, and it is made illegally. The F.W. Murnau just decided to shoot a version of Dracula. Bram Stoker is dead at this point. He died in 1912, but his widow is still alive, and she said, you can't make this movie without asking my permission to use my husband's characters. They did it anyway, and so she sued them. And she won, and she said, you have to destroy all copies of this movie in existence. And they said, okay, we will, and of course they didn't. So it still exists today. And it's very different from the novel. I think that was to avoid the copyright issues. They were trying to make it slightly different. But this is Count Orlok, he's Count Dracula. And it's a very creepy film if you watch it. Like, it's really creepy. I find it a really disturbing film to watch because it's made in 1922 in Germany, and so you can tell a lot of it is sort of anti-Semitic in tone. His makeup's very meant to be like a caricature of the Jewish people. He's there hoarding gold and rubbing his hands. So I don't like it because that's real-life horror that ends in the Holocaust, which is, particularly relevant due to recent events. So I don't like watching it, but it is a very effective movie in terms of what it's trying to do, which is to freak people out because his makeup and his performance is excellent. And then about 10 years later, you get Bela Lugosi, and he becomes sort of the iconic Dracula. And to this day, you have parody versions where they go, I want to suck your blood, I am Dracula. And that's Bela Lugosi, because he's from Hungary. He has that accent very naturally. And it was a huge hit in 1931. If you watch it today, it's not particularly explicit because it's made in 1931. So he doesn't actually like bite anyone. And there's a portion where the girl is talking about he bent down and bit me on the wrist because I guess biting someone on the neck is a bit too sexy for 1931. But it's based on a play version of Dracula, so it's not. It's a good film. Like I recommend it. I recommend you watch most of these. But it's not the book, and neither is the next one, which is my particular favorite. 1958, Britain, Hammer Films makes a version of Dracula with Christopher Lee as Count Dracula, who's my personal favorite. It's the first time Dracula's in color, and they use it to great effect in Hammer. They have blood, and they have women with heaving bosoms, and it's just, classic stuff. Who he menaces. And it's very explicit what he's doing. There's a scene where he, like, pushes a woman down on the bed. So you're getting a bit more, it's like, okay, not as censorious, great, but they did threaten to cut that scene in 1958 because they thought it was a bit too sexy. But they left it in, and as I say, it's a great movie. He's, to me, definitive because he does that viciousness, that animal savagery that Dracula has so well. There's other Dracula versions, but the other big one is in 1992. You have Gary Oldman in Bram Stoker's Dracula. I always do the air quotes because it's nothing like Bram Stoker's Dracula. I get very annoyed that it's called that because they turn Dracula into this kind of romantic figure who's like, I'm trying to find my wife who died and I only love you. And that's nothing like the book. It's really irritating to me. But again, it's a very explicit movie. I don't care for it, but some of you might, and that's cool. But it sort of turns Dracula into this kind of romantic figure, and it sort of turns the vampire into that direction as well. What are we doing on time? Okay, yeah, should be good. So, and as Dracula becomes more popular, into the 70s and stuff, you have him being parodied, which is great. Like, who doesn't love the Count from Sesame Street? He's great. But the only reason the Count works is because you kind of get the joke, right? He's a Count who counts, like Count Dracula, And children get the joke now. And you have them on cereal boxes. You got Count Chocula, and that's funny. You have the Mel Brooks parody in 95, which is actually a hilarious movie. I rewatched it again recently with Leslie Nielsen as Dracula. And then recently you have the Hotel Transylvania series where you have Dracula doing, I don't say blah, 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 which is actually a meta joke because he's parodying a parodying version of Dracula from the 60s. And so you get this kind of, now he's sort of a joke. And that's fine. Like, again, it's fun to make fun of things. But the problem with making things a parody or a joke is that they become a punchline and people don't take them seriously anymore. And they're kind of, well, it's Dracula, who cares? And so it loses some of its power. Dracula loses some of his threat when he's, dancing Hotel Transylvania. You can't take him seriously as much. And then as we move into the 20th century and then the 21st century, you have this romantic vampire figure taken to the extreme. So you have Anne Rice. Her book is published in actually 1978, but the film version, Memories of the Vampire, is 94. And Louis is this kind of, I don't want to be a vampire. He's very whiny. And you get similar things with Twilight. I don't want to hurt you. I'm vegetarian and I sparkle. And so you take the vampire from its origins of like a creature that people really believed in and was really terrifying to something that's kind of either a joke or kind of, oh gosh, I really want to be a vampire. Wouldn't that be great? It's like, no, it wouldn't be great because you have to murder people to live. It's not a great way to live, people. But it's become this kind of desirable figure. And again, as I said, there were hints of it in the Victorian era, but it wasn't, there were consequences, right? If you were going to get involved with a vampire, you would die or you would be damned. And now Bella gets to marry Edward and it's all great and they can live forever. And it's like, no, that's not what a vampire is. Like, you can't have a happy ending when you have to kill people. Like, that doesn't work morally. And so what happened? Well, I sort of talked about what happened. Our culture has turned a cold, alienating, impersonal monster obsessed with power and possession into the hero of eternal romance. So we've humanized our vampires. We give them good blood to save them or turn their bites into gentle exchanges. They anguish over moral questions. And says Glennis Byron in the introduction to Dracula in 2006, says, perhaps we've lost the true threat, the true violence of Stoker's King Vampire, and I believe we have. I believe we've tried to separate it from its roots too much. This is a creature, again, that comes from a religious context. It's a demonic creature, but because we don't have a religion as prevalent in our day, we kind of separate it from that, and it doesn't work, right? You have to have the fear. You can't have the, oh, it's great, I can live forever with the person I love, which, by the way, would not work. You would want to kill each other after probably about 50 years. But yeah, and so I think that's a reflection of our own culture. And obviously the vampires always reflect the culture in which they're written, but our particular culture, I think, has really made them a bit bloodless, if you'll forgive the joke there. And I just want to reinstate, this is my Dracula, this is Christopher Lee, this is from the book, and he encapsulates the demonic fury perfectly. And so I'd like us, just a personal thing, to kind of get back to that version, right? You know, he's kind of a threat, he's kind of scary, you don't want to meet him on a dark night, and that's what Halloween's all about, is enjoying being scared. And so that's my just personal preference, personal plea, to try and get the vampire back to its roots, and I hope I've helped you learn what those are. Thank you very much.
Let's open the floor up for some questions. Anybody have any questions? Raise your hand. I'll come around with the microphone. I will start off, and I will ask Dr. Bryan, can you tell us about the books that you've written and where we might find those?
Yes, I can. Thank you for the question. Totally unprompted question, by the way. My books are available on Amazon. I write under the name M.H. Bryan, which are my initials, Megan Helene Bryan. And I've written 5 books. I'm working on the 6th. And my books are basically, because I said earlier, Dracula doesn't have a voice in the book, which is a shame because I'm sort of in love with him, as you might gather. And so my books are trying to marry the version of Dracula that's the vampire with the more historical associations of Vlad the Impaler. And so I'm basically making him a character who is growing up in this warlike time, and how he copes and how he eventually becomes the monster that he is in Dracula. So it's sort of a prequel type thing. I know prequels aren't always great, but I think mine are pretty good. But yeah, the 5th book, he has just become a vampire, so the 6th one is him trying to cope with what he's done. And eventually I'm trying to connect it to Bram Stoker's actual work, but that'll probably take a couple more books. But yeah, please check them out. They're on Amazon. M.H. Bryan, the first one is called Son of the Dragon, and they're all of the dragon, so that's how you'll know it's me.
Over back here. Okay. I said none. I greatly exaggerated my ability.
So, do you think like the Christian shift from punishment to redemption kind of changed the idea into like made Dracula a more romantic figure that he is today, or like vampires in general?
I think it's not even redemption, because again, the idea that I mentioned earlier, that like if you become a vampire, it's usually because you did something sort of unforgivable, right? Like the suicide. And so you can't be redeemed. And so to me, that's, again, it's incompatible with the vampire after you've murdered people to live, which is what vampires have to do, that you could be forgiven for this kind of thing. And you can, like, obviously, if it was against your will, you know, if you're a victim of vampire, that's fine. I think my thesis, it's more that it's the absence of the domination of Christianity over our culture, right? That you start separating. You're like, well, things don't have to be religious, which, you know, they don't. But then I think you lose the root of what that character is, right? Because it's so, it's such a part of the Christian and religious tradition that if you separate it, I think it just loses its power, because then it can be, you know, it could be immortal love. Why not? If you lose the context of, well, it's an actual demon. And so that's my thesis, that I think it's more about the decline of religion in general. And so we try and redeem all of the things that were previously considered sinful and evil, to, you know, with good. I'm not making a moral judgment on that. But it just seems to me that if particularly if it's something that's bad, like I think Anne Rice did write something about Satan is apparently misunderstood. And I'm like, well, if you can redeem Satan, who is the villain now, right? And as someone who really loves villains, that's my concern. I just don't want to see like all the bad things suddenly be, oh, they're misunderstood, or they're actually okay, because then I don't have anything to enjoy. So, yeah.
So what are your feelings about Anne Rice's vampire chrono?
I'm not a big fan, as you probably
You're
know.
not a big fan?
No, I kind of, I mean, she's fine, but I kind of blame her for the trajectory it went on, right? Because she started an Interview with the Vampire, making them this kind of sympathetic, you know, it's really sad. They don't really want to be the monsters that they are. And the interviewer at the end of Interview with the Vampire is like, I want to be a vampire and all this. And so I have no problem actually with her at all. But I think she opened the floodgates to that kind of interpretation of, oh, but wouldn't it be good if they were just, we could save them all. And my problem is, if you try and decouple the vampire from religion, which I'm sure you can do well, and lots of people have, you know, there have been versions of vampires where it's like a plague, and there's like a scientific explanation. I think those are really interesting. But Anne Rice does that. You know, she's like, the cross doesn't affect the vampire anymore because they're not religious. It's like, okay, so what are they? And she doesn't really ever explain it. And it's like, well, so you've just made a demonic thing, but you're saying there's no God. So what is this thing? Like, and that's just, I have a logical mind. Like, no, how does this actually work? And she doesn't explain that. So I get kind of frustrated with it.
I like the rules. I like rules. I like vampires to have rules.
Me too. Well, that's what's so good. If you read Dracula, they literally spend like a couple pages outlining all the rules. And I'm like, thank you. Now I know what this thing can do and what it can't do. It's not just suddenly, oh, now he can turn into a bat. It's like, wait, where was that? But that's what's so great about Dracula is that he's very explicit about this is what a vampire does, this is what a vampire is. And I like that because, again, then it gives me an investment into this character. And it's like, okay, it has these rules. Now, how are you going to defeat it based on these rules? So it's kind of a fair fight thing. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is in direct response to Stoker's Dracula. So in the book, you see lots of religious symbolism and not so much, in my opinion, like God or Jesus or that representation. So how do you kind of view that and attach that? Because you reference this moving towards our twinkling vampires as kind of our transition into a less regulated religious society. So how do you kind of play that in his interpretation of Christianity in the Dracula?
Well, I think his interpretation is very clear that God exists, right? He doesn't interfere. But like, Van Helsing uses the sacred wafer. They're always praying, they're always on their knees thanking God for stuff. The cross is very effective. They use the cross all the time. And Van Helsing is a Catholic. He keeps talking about like Catholic rituals. He can't divorce his wife because she's insane. He's a Catholic. And so religion is very present in Stoker's Dracula. It's interesting because Bram Stoker was Irish, but he was a Protestant Irish. And so he left Ireland because that wasn't always the friendliest place to be, a Protestant Irish person. He lived in England for most of his life. And so I think he has this weird ambivalence about, like, is Protestantism or Catholicism correct? Because his family, his mother was Catholic, but then he became a Protestant. And so I think it's not an explicit as much, like it's not like there is a God and this is how God works, but he still has that, there is a religion, right? And I don't know which religion it is, but it's some kind of Christian religion. And he has that foundation in the book. And so I think what really, and I talked about this a bit, what really works with the way Stoker wrote Dracula is that he marries the superstition and the kind of, wouldn't call religious superstition, but the religious and the superstitious with the science and technology of his day. And so they hunt Dracula down by like looking at railway times tables and recording things on phonographs. And it's all this like modern Victorian technology married with this kind of superstitious religious context. And I think that's why the book works so well, because it's not taking like one or the other. It's saying both are needed to defeat great evil, essentially. And that's why I love it. Like it's both knowledge and faith, which I think is great.
Is this on? Oh, sorry. I have a question. I don't know where I've gotten this perception from, so that's kind of the question, that the vampire was created from Judas as a punishment for betraying Jesus, and that's the curse that the vampire must carry forever. And so where does that come from? And then kind of a second question, different, but like, what do you think about the TV show True Blood and how they they portray vampires? Because I'm like just re-watching that, and so the idea that it seems completely divorced from the religious connotation, right, that you kind of talked about with Anne Rice.
I didn't finish True Blood, so I don't know that I can analyze it well, because I watched a couple episodes. I'm like, this isn't for me. This is too. But yeah, the other question, there's a lot of I don't want to say apocryphal, because again, who am I to say what's apocryphal or not? But there's a lot of councils of faith that are taking place. Was it 14th, 15th century? And they're basically going through the Bible and deciding what's true and what isn't. And a lot of these things come out of there. I think there's the book of, I can't remember the name of the book. Anyway, there's parts of the Bible that were previously in the Bible, and then they decide suddenly that's not right, and they cut it out. And I don't think the Judas one's in there. The one that I've heard a lot is that the vampire's descendant of Cain, because Cain in the Bible, as we know it now, his descendants are like the war makers, and like all of his descendants are to evil, basically to destroy humanity. But it's entirely possible that because vampirism became this kind of craze, as I talked about in the 18th century, when it starts going from, it's very localized into Eastern Europe, into like Europe, Western Europe, where, a lot of people are writing, a lot of people are communicating, there's a lot of people sharing this idea. Because at one point the Vatican has to step in and say, vampires are in fact recognized by the Catholic Church, but don't worry, because they're nothing to be afraid of. What they are is just the bodies of your dead loved ones possessed by Satan. So why would you be afraid of that? And it's like, why did you think that would calm people down? Because it didn't calm people down. But that was in the 17th century where they did that. So it's entirely possible it came from one of these things where someone put this in and said, oh, that'll be a vampire. And someone, no, that's not. But yeah, I've heard, again, Cain, Judas strains of that. There's a strain about Lilith, Adam's first wife, and all this sorts of thing, which I know was in one of the exercise books of the Bible. So it's picking which bits of religion you think are correct, which I don't know.
Yeah, you do. It's fine. You'll be fine.
Do you have any thoughts about the obsession of zombies as the undead and the apocalypse, rather like replacing religion in that way? Or
Yeah, well, and I
that
think
makes sense.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's interesting as well. A lot of the vampires that you'll see, like Anne Rice's vampires or the Twilight vampires, there's someone else I'm blanking on. Anyway, they use the vampire as kind of like a metaphor, right? Like Anne Rice wrote a lot of her books during the AIDS crisis, and so that the vampire is kind of the metaphor for the spread of AIDS, the disease in the blood, that kind of thing. Stephanie Meyer, when she wrote Twilight, is very explicit about this. She says, I want it to be like why you shouldn't have sex before marriage. And so that's what, like, he doesn't bite her before marriage, wink. But, she's using this as a kind of metaphor. And I think you're right. Like, a lot of the zombie stuff, it's why I'm not that into zombies, because a lot of, like, the zombie shows, like Walking Dead and stuff, are about, it's not about the zombie, it's about, like, isn't humanity awful? Like, the undead are almost preferable to what we do to each other, essentially. And that's a lot of what, like, the vampire is too. Like, a lot of times they're using the vampire as a metaphor for something else, particularly post-Freud, because it becomes like a sort of sexual, it's the penetration of the steak, we all get what's going on here. And that's fine. Again, I have no problem with that particular interpretation, but it's just, it seems to me that's very modern. That's like 20th century. You start using it as meaning something else. While previously, there was Polidori who was like, this is why you shouldn't get involved with Lord Byron. But it was a creature in its own right. It had its own history. It had its own belief structure. It had its own way to be killed and all this sorts of thing. And now we kind of just pick and choose what we want from it. And we're like, well, it's going to be a metaphor for this. It's the same with zombies. It's going to be a metaphor for, COVID or the spread of the plague or whatever it is. And I have an English degree, but I don't find it particularly interesting. Like, I want to understand where this belief comes from and why people believed it. And that's just my thing. And I think using it as a metaphor makes it effective in certain contexts, but also, as I say, drains it of a little of its significance. So just a personal thing.
I had a question. Have you ever heard of this anime, and it's about vampires, called The Case Study of Vanitas?
I have a confession to make. When I was 15, I hung out with all the group of kids who were into the anime, and I've never been into anime. And they said, we'll find you an anime that you can get into. And I watched probably about 200 animes, and I never got into any of them. And so now I have this kind of like, if someone says anime, I'm like, no, because it's kind of like the Pavlov thing. Like, I've seen it, I don't like it. And someone was like, you should watch, was it Castlevania? I'm like, no, I can't do that because I'm triggered by it. And so, no, I haven't heard of it. But is it good?
Yeah, they have, like, a very different take on vampires and their lore and how they work. And it's really interesting. Same with this other one that my grandma found called Noblesse. They both have very different takes on vampires and how they work and all their lore, and I thought it was really interesting. So
Yeah, as I said, I really like different takes on the lore. I like scientific explanations and stuff. I just don't like dispensing with the lore and then not putting anything in its place, which is a lot of what's going on now. And so that's just, a pet peeve of mine. But I will try and give the anime a chance, and I'll see what that's like.
As I'm going over to this question, I'd like to remind people that on the tables are a QR code for evaluations. So make sure that you get that before you leave. Here you go.
So I know that there's a bunch of people these days that also love really scary things, horror, gore. But the classics now, like Frankenstein and zombies and vampires, don't scare people as much anymore. Do you think that the things we find scary today will also will undergo this change, and then vampires will just become a thing of children's play?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful story by Ray Bradbury, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, and I'll look it up later. Anyway, Ray Bradbury vampire, Google it. And it's a futuristic story set in like 3025 or something, and it's about the last vampire ever, and he wakes up because he's a vampire, and he realizes that nobody's scared of vampires anymore because they're like, why would anyone be scared of death? You know, we've moved beyond that. And so he can't frighten anyone anymore. And it's a really sad, like, I cried because suddenly people are so rational, they're not afraid of these things anymore. I don't know if that'll ever happen, by the way. I don't think we're particularly rational in this day and age, although we claim we are, but recent events prove otherwise. But I think there'll be a resurgence because a lot of the stuff that we're afraid of now is really realistic. I don't particularly like slasher films or anything because, again, to me that's too real. It's why I don't like Nosferatu, because I'm like, I've seen where real hatred and real violence can lead historically, and I'm not comfortable with it. And I think we'll stop being afraid of slasher movies in the next couple years. You know, we'll kind of get bored of it and we'll want to find something new. And what's great about the vampire, not only in movies, is that he always comes back in a different form, some form or another. And so I think again, I don't know. I'm not going to predict the future, but because, as I say, we live in a kind of really scientific, rational age, supposedly, there might be a pendulum swing back to a less scientific, rational age, and we'll be more afraid of things that are like inexplicable or supernatural. That's certainly what happened with the Victorians, because you had the Enlightenment, you had rationalism, and that's when the supernatural became more powerful and more strong. People really appealed. In a Victorian era, ghost stories and vampire stories are everywhere. And so I'm hoping something like that will happen here, is that we'll, in a reaction to the rationalism, we might be more afraid of things that we would have been afraid of as children, because it'll be a reverse. I hope. I don't know.
Hi, I like vampire movies too, and I was just wondering what you thought about the portrayal of the vampire in The Lost Boys.
I feel like I'm being so negative. I don't like to be negative, but Joel Schumacher, really, I can't stand anything he ever made. He ruined my Phantom of the Opera movie, his worst movie, and my favorite musical. He ruined it. He ruined Batman, which is another one of my favorite things. So I'm sure it's good. I can't watch him anymore because I've seen Batman and Robin, and I've seen the Phantom of the Opera movie, and I'm like, no more Joel Schumacher. So I haven't given it a chance. But I've heard good things about it. Yeah. Is it good? Okay, good. I will try and get over my Joel Schumacher loathing, but it's really hard. It's a visceral kind of loathing.
So where does Dracula or just vampires not being able to see themselves in the mirror come from?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that. I always forget to mention that. So again, the religious context of the vampire is important in this case because I think it's Judaism today. In Jewish culture, when somebody dies, you have to cover up all the mirrors in your house because they believe the soul can get trapped in the mirror because the soul is drawn to the reflection. And that's very common. It's not just Judaism. And it certainly was more common back in the day. I think the Orthodox tradition also had that. But it's because of the belief that the mirror reflects your soul, right? And it can trap your soul if you believe that. And vampires have no soul because, again, they've committed the worst sin ever, so they're soulless demons. And so they can't be reflected. They have nothing to reflect. And again, that's a very, not common anymore, but was a very common thing certainly several hundred years ago, that mirrors were something that would reflect back the essence of you. And that's why they thought, like, when they started making like cameras and things, people didn't want their picture taken with cameras because they thought the camera might steal their soul. So there's always been this association between the reflection and the soul. And so if you don't have a soul, you don't reflect in the mirror. The other, again, more metaphorical interpretation of that is that if there's a vampire if you're looking in the mirror and there's a vampire behind you, you can't see the vampire, you can only see yourself. So what does that mean, metaphorically? It means that you're the monster. So again, metaphorically. But the context is the religious context about the soul. Yeah.
What's your take on Master from Salem's Lot? Did Stephen King get it right?
Yes, yes, that's a good one. Thank you. Thank you for letting me not be negative. Yes. Yes, Salem's Lot is great. Yeah, yeah. And again, you can see he's based on more the Nosferatu type, the kind of... there's a really good movie, again, I don't just want to be negative. There was a really good movie that was made in like 2010, I think it's 2010, called Daybreakers with Sam Neill. And it had this really cool theory, again, that if the vampires got blood, they looked like us, they were normal people. But then if they didn't get blood, they would like devolve into these kind of like Nosferatu bat creatures. And it was so cool. Like, I really loved this movie. And it wasn't, I don't think it was very big success at the time, but I was like, that's such a cool idea that you have like the evolution and de-evolution of the vampire. So yeah, check out Daybreakers for sure. Good Halloween watch.
So when you say that vampires don't have a soul, do you mean that they don't have like a first-person consciousness, like a first-person experience, or is that separate from the soul?
That's separate from the soul. They
Okay.
have, like that's to me that's why I like vampires as opposed to zombies, because zombies are kind of just mindless, brainless. Need brains. Vampires can always think and feel, and some of them don't feel much after murdering people for 500 years. But it's usually, again, you can be victimized by vampires where it's not a conscious choice, but it's a conscious choice to embrace the evil, essentially. And that's why I think it's so interesting, because like, what makes people do that, right? And so they have a consciousness. It's just not, again, it's more of a religious concept of the soul. Like, there's nothing to save, essentially. And that's what happens in Christianity anyway, is that your soul is saved when you go to heaven. There's nothing that can go to heaven anymore because you're damned.
So I'm in a humanities class right now. We're talking about vampires. I wanted to ask you what you think about the fact that we've gone to a very like humanistic, humanoid vampire, whereas like before, if you look at historical references to Bloodsucker, it was very monstrous. You got creatures like separating their bodies, or just being inhumane. Usually, like what I wanted to ask what you thought about the fact that now they're just basically just people almost in the sense of like how they look.
They were people before. Like, the folklore are just your friends and neighbors who've come back from the dead, and that's how they strike, is because they look just like you. And that's what, like, Dracula in the book is planning to take over England, and he says to Harker, you have to correct me if I sound foreign to you, because I want to blend in completely. I want to be exactly like a normal Englishman, because that's how he gets his power, is by nobody suspecting. And that's why, you get the Lugosi version where, he's like, Harker, Dracula, and there's like a cobweb, and it's like, Dracula is not there being creepy on purpose. He's trying to fool people into thinking he's a regular guy. We did a class at UNT about the history of supernatural, which I didn't teach. And they were talking about like werewolves and the kind of like inhuman animalistic thing. And the person who taught that was saying that's vampires. I'm like, that's never been vampires. I don't know where you're getting that information. Vampires have always been kind of human, but just not emotional. We make them more human in the sense that they have emotions and feelings. And again, in the folklore, it was more just, it was a demonic entity that would destroy you. And it could have been your husband or your best friend or your dad or your mom, and it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't understand that. They would just kill you. And so you can have human form and still be inhuman, and that's what I like about the vampire, is that it fools you, as opposed to like a werewolf where it's just animal fury.
Yeah, going back to your thing, what you're saying about werewolves, do you think that it is just like make-believe, or do you actually like saw any connection with werewolves as well as you did with vampires?
Do I think werewolves are like real, or I don't think vampires are real either.
Yeah. But like any like research or anything that you were doing with werewolves as well as you did with vampires?
I've never really been into werewolves because I don't really, I think I like the conscious choice to commit evil, right? I'm interested in that. And werewolves, it's like you get bitten by the wolf, and then the full moon comes, and you have to turn into a monster, and there's no control, right? Vampires have control, which is what I think is so interesting about them. But there's always this weird connection, like an underworld, where like the vampires and the werewolves were like fighting, and then there's another one. There's witches, covenant of witches, or something. Which anyway, the vampires and the werewolves come from like the same strain, and I'm like, I don't really understand why people connect those two things. I mean, vampires can change into wolves. That is the thing that they have. So maybe that's the connection. But like werewolves are very different. It's more about the animalistic nature of like, and again, I think metaphorically, it's like letting go of your animal side and becoming an animal. And a vampire has an animalistic side, but again, it's the human animal hybrid thing that I'm interested in, because I just think it's more interesting when you can choose to do that rather than I'm overcome by a magic that makes me turn into a wolf. But yeah, so I've never actually seen a good werewolf movie. So if someone can recommend that to me, I've seen a lot of werewolf movies, but one that I'm like, that's a really good one. Never happened. So Teen Wolf, okay, yeah, I've heard things. So yeah, I do like Michael J. Fox. So
All right. We want to present you with these lovely gifts. And that is a little tiny vampire bat. These were made by my colleagues, Sarah and Samantha in the back there. In their, what is it? It's Needle Arts Club that we have here. They crocheted and knitted those things. And so we want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And we have more goodies here that we want to give away to some lucky members of the audience with this Halloween trivia contest. And so if you know the answer to the question that will appear up on the screen, I need you to raise your hand real big and tall so that I can see who is kind of firstish. All right, I'm not like yeah, there can be. I don't think I can be exact. I will do the best I can to make sure that many of you have an opportunity to get some of our treats here. So, all right, Sarah, hit it. I think your hand was up first.
Beetlejuice?
Oh, you said it 3 times. Better look out. Absolutely, Beetlejuice. Here we go. Pick one of these lovely goodies here. All right. All right. I'm paying attention now. I think it's over here. It's over here. Yeah, you were ready for it? All right, what's the answer?
It's Freddy. Freddy Krueger.
Okay, I was like, are you going to say his full name? Could just be any Freddy. All right, hang on. I have to get up here so I can see. Are you helping me be a spotter? Okay, thanks. All right.
Hocus Pocus.
Hocus Pocus. Yes. Oh, here you go. Pick a prize. There you go. Chucky does not have a last name. All right. All right. I think it's you.
Get Out.
All right. Oh, okay. You weren't saying that to me. Okay. Huh? Come on. No. I think you were quick.
Pennywise.
Pennywise. Get that off of there. Can't look at them.
Oh, who you gonna call? Ghostbusters.
I have to get to a spot. Who is it? Over here? Okay.
Crap. I lost it.
Oh no.
I know.
Sweatshirt in the middle. Here we go.
The Shining.
The Shining. Uh-huh. Over up here? Okay. Yeah, the real name.
Friday the 13th.
That's the movie.
Jason Voorhees.
Jason Voorhees. There you go. You could have a spider or two, too. I saw that one.
Blair Witch Project.
Absolutely, Blair Witch Project. Scared the crap out of us for a while. Okay.
Rocky Horror Picture Show.
That's right. Has everybody gone to see that? That's all we have. Oh, tell the joke. Okay. All right. One joke, and I would like to note that this is Vanessa's joke. What is a vampire's favorite candy? Suckers. That's right. You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Make sure you fill out those evaluations, the QR code on the tables. Thank you, everybody.